Sometimes secrets weigh more than stones. They settle in your chest, and even if you learn to walk with them, they leave invisible marks. I've carried such a weight for decades, like someone keeping an old letter hidden in a drawer, afraid that if I open it, the paper will crumble in my hands. Today, as the pigeons peck at breadcrumbs around me in the park, I've decided I'm not taking it with me to the other side. I want this story to stay here, in words, so that someone out there will understand that silence can be its own kind of punishment. This helps me keep sharing stories like this. So if you can, please like the video and subscribe. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? My name is Margaret Eleanor Brooks. I'm 74 years old, and you might recognize me as the old lady in a floral dress who sits on the park bench every afternoon, scattering crumbs for the pigeons. I live alone in a small apartment with white painted walls just a few blocks from here. I don't have much in the way of luxury, but I keep my pots of geraniums on the balcony and a notebook where I write down the things I never dared to say out loud for years. Today, those pages are opening for you because there are memories that, if not shared, rot inside and eventually consume you. Telling this story feels like unfastening an old wound. My hands shake, not from age, but from respect for the little girl I once was, the one who never had anyone to ask for help. It has taken me a lifetime to gather the courage to speak certain truths, and I know my voice, cracked and slow, may not reach everyone, but maybe it will reach someone who needs it. I'm not looking for revenge. I just want to leave proof that I existed, that I felt, and that I survived. When I close my eyes, I see that little girl running barefoot across a dusty backyard, thinking the world ended at the white picket fence. I see my mother bent over the vegetable garden, her hands buried in cool soil, and my father walking through the door with boots coated in mud. That life wasn't rich in possessions, but it overflowed with warmth. We didn't know abundance in objects, but we had an abundance of hugs and laughter. Maybe that's why what came next hurt so deeply, because once you've known true warmth, loss feels like a winter that never ends. And yet, here I am, retracing my steps to tell you how the little girl behind the picket fence learned that the truth, however painful, is always lighter than a lie. For me, childhood always smelled like cornbread fresh from the oven and coffee brewing slowly in the kitchen. Our house sat on the edge of a small town in rural Kansas, painted a pale blue that the summer sun slowly faded. The yard was dusty most of the year, but in spring, wildflowers pushed up between the fence posts like they were asking to be part of our games. Mornings began with the rooster's call and the far-off chime of the church bell. We lived with just enough, but in that, enough was everything I needed to feel safe and happy. My mother, Helen, had hands both strong and gentle. She could knead bread dough with the same certainty she used to keep troubles away from our door. She always wore a faded apron dusted with flour, humming old country songs as she worked. I'd sit on a small stool by the table, watching her fingers turn simple ingredients into small miracles. Sometimes she'd give me a bit of dough to shape into my own rolls, which she'd bake alongside hers, though mine always came out lopsided. My father, Robert, worked the fields long before the sun came up. He'd return at dusk with sweat-dampened shirts and a face weathered by wind and sun. He never complained. After washing his hands at the pump outside, he'd sit at the table, ruffle my hair, and ask about my adventures that day, like I was some explorer mapping out new lands. I'd tell him wild stories about treasure buried under the old oak, and he'd pretend to be amazed. Sundays were sacred in our house. After church, my mother would cook a pot roast that filled the rooms with rich, warm smells. We'd gather at the big kitchen table, my older brother James and my younger sister Annie arguing over who got the biggest biscuit, and me soaking it all in, wanting to remember every smile, every laugh. In the afternoons, we'd drive to the creek, wading into water so cold it bit our toes, but we'd stay until Mom called us back, waving from the bank. Winters felt quieter, cozier, when the cold slipped through the cracks in the house, we'd huddle around the wood stove. My grandmother would tell stories about ghosts haunting old barns and love affairs that never stood a chance. I'd curl up under a wool blanket, listening wide-eyed while the wind rattled the shutters. It was the perfect sound to fall asleep to, knowing I was safe. In our town, everyone knew everyone else, and the streets felt like an extension of our home. If I fell and scraped my knee, some neighbor would come, out with a damp rag to clean it up. The 4th of July was the biggest event of the year. Paper lanterns strung between telephone poles, fiddles and banjos playing, and the smell of funnel cakes drifting through the air. I loved watching the grown-ups dance under the lights while us kids chased fireflies in the grass. School was about a 20-minute walk away. We went in a little pack, James striding ahead like the leader he thought he was, Annie and I trailing behind. Our teacher, Mrs. Thompson, had a strict way about her, but her voice softened when we read poetry. She was the one who taught me that words could be a kind of shelter, and I think that's why I cling to them so much now. Summer afternoons seemed endless. We'd draw hopscotch squares with chalk stolen from the schoolroom, or hide in the tall grass near the wheat fields. The heat shimmered in the air, and Mom would bring out jars of lemonade with ice clinking inside. Sometimes, if Dad's work allowed, he'd hitch up the wagon and take us to the edge of the woods, where we'd gather pine cones and run until we couldn't catch our breath. We never had store-bought toys, but our imaginations were enough. James and I made wooden swords, and Annie and I stitched rag dolls from scraps Mom kept in a sewing box. Each doll had a name, a story, and even a voice. In those games, anything was possible, and everything was good. If I close my eyes, I can still feel the rough grain of the kitchen table, hear the crunch of bread breaking, and the laughter of my siblings bouncing off the walls. We were a small, self-contained world, held together by the love of our parents. I believed nothing could ever break that harmony. But the truth is, time always has its own plans. And while I didn't know it then, my childhood was about to shatter all at once, like a glass jar slipping from your hands. Sometimes I think real happiness isn't about what you have. It's about not knowing yet what you can lose. And back then I knew nothing about loss. The afternoon it all changed didn't seem special at first. The sun was sliding low over the rooftops, and my mother was in the kitchen making chicken soup. I was sitting on the front steps, dragging a stick through the dirt still damp from a light morning rain. The air smelled clean, fresh. I felt calm. Then from inside, I heard a sharp cry, a sound like glass shattering. I dropped the stick and ran. When I reached the kitchen, I saw Mom doubled over the table, clutching her chest. Dad rushed in from the yard, his face tight with panic. Together we tried to steady her, but her knees buckled and she crumpled to the floor. Everything blurred, the spoon clattering on the linoleum, steam curling from the pot, and then the awful stillness. James bolted for the doctor's office down the street, but by the time he came back, Mom's eyes had already lost their light. The news traveled fast. Within an hour, neighbors filled the house, bringing words of comfort, casseroles, and blankets nobody could touch. I sat in the corner, watching the world move at a pace I couldn't keep up with. Annie cried into Grandma's arms, and James busied himself helping Dad greet people, though he could barely stand. The funeral was the next day. The church bells rang deep and slow, each toll echoing inside my chest. We carried the casket down Main Street, our steps heavy and final. I remember thinking the town sounded the same, birds chirping, water running from the fountain. Yet for me, everything had gone still. After she was gone, the house lost its smell of bread and coffee. Silence became another occupant, settling in every corner. Dad tried to keep our routines going, but it was clear he was adrift. His eyes dimmed a little more each day, as if Mom's absence had stolen his sense of direction. I tried to care for Annie, braiding her hair like Mom used to, and help James with chores, but there was an emptiness nothing could fill. That winter came early, or maybe it just felt that way. The nights were long and cold. And without Mom, the wood stove didn't seem to warm us the same. Some nights, I thought I heard her humming in the kitchen, but when I opened my eyes, the room was dark and still. It was during one of those nights that I overheard Dad talking to Grandma. Someone was coming to live with us, to help out. At the time, I didn't know what that meant. I thought maybe a distant aunt or an older cousin would come to keep us company. I welcomed the idea with a child's trust, thinking any adult who walked through our door would bring something good. I couldn't have imagined that this arrival would mark the beginning of a chapter darker than any winter night. He arrived on a cold morning, the sky pressed low with heavy clouds. I was in the backyard, trying to start a small fire with twigs, when I heard the creak of the front gate. Dad walked in with a tall, thin man wearing a black hat pulled low over his face. His long coat was spattered with mud, and in his hand was a worn leather suitcase. "This is your Uncle Edward," Dad said, though I'd never heard the name before. His voice sounded forced, like he was reading lines someone else had written. Edward gave me a smile that didn't reach his eyes. They seemed to measure me slowly, as if weighing and cataloging me. He held out his hand, moving deliberately, too deliberately, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Annie, curious as ever, ran up to greet him, and he ruffled her hair with what looked like affection, but something in his touch made me uneasy. That first night, Edward sat at our table like he'd always belonged there. He told stories about working odd jobs across different states, about traveling, about becoming a man of the world. Dad listened in silence, his brow furrowed but didn't interrupt. When I asked why I'd never heard of this uncle before, Dad only said it wasn't important. His answer stuck in my throat like a lump I couldn't swallow. In the days that followed, Edward began taking over spaces that used to belong to Mom or Dad. He went to the store instead of Dad, reorganized kitchen drawers to make them better, and even started telling us when it was time to go to bed. He said it was for our own good, though we needed discipline. James bristled at this, but Dad, worn down and tired, never said a word. I learned to keep quiet too, though unease was already settling inside me. Little by little, Edward found reasons to be alone with me. He'd ask me to help in the shed, to bring him tools, or to go through old boxes in the attic. In those moments his voice slowed, his gaze lingered, and something invisible but foul seemed to hang in the air. I tried to stay busy, to avoid being near him, but it wasn't always possible. The first signs were small, things no one else would notice. He'd close the door behind us, rest his hand on my shoulder a beat too long, or whisper things I didn't fully understand. But that made me feel wrong inside. When I told Annie, she laughed and said I was being dramatic. James just frowned but didn't press me for details. Fear became part of my everyday life. It didn't scream, it crept, quiet and steady, like a shadow that never let go. I began avoiding certain parts of the house, sleeping with my back to the wall and a chair wedged against the door. But Edward always found ways to get close, whether through an excuse or a simple, "Come here, I need you for something." He started talking about keeping secrets, warning me that what happened in the house wasn't anybody else's business. He said if I spoke up, Dad would be angry, maybe even send me away. I didn't know whether to believe him, but I was too afraid to find out. Sometimes, across the dinner table, he'd stare at me while everyone else talked, as if reminding me who was in control. That stare was enough to make bread stick in my throat and stew taste like ashes. One afternoon, while Annie and I played in the yard, Edward leaned down and whispered something that froze my blood. "I'll always be here, even when you can't see me." It wasn't a threat for the moment. It was a promise of permanence. And the worst part was, no one else seemed willing to see him for what he was. The town kept moving, full of noise and life. But for me, it was becoming a maze where every turn might bring me face to face with him. And the harder I tried to escape, the closer he seemed. I learned then that predators don't always hide in the dark. Sometimes they sit at your table, eat your bread, and win everyone's trust before showing their real teeth. Silence became my only armor. At first I tried dropping hints to James, but he was too busy helping Dad keep the farm running. Annie was still too young to understand anything, so I learned not to speak. I told myself that if I stayed still, if I avoided drawing attention, Edward would lose interest. I didn't realize then that silence, while it shields you, also traps you. I began changing the way I dressed. I stopped wearing the light cotton dresses Mom had sewn for summer and started wearing long skirts and loose blouses. Even in the suffocating August heat, I'd say I was cold, but in truth, I was afraid of the lingering glances. When we went to the creek, I stayed on the bank, pretending to watch over the towels. Nights filled with insomnia, the creak of the old wood, the wind rattling the shutters. Any sound could be a warning. I slept with my back to the wall, fists clenched under the blanket. Sometimes I'd get up in the middle of the night, sit by the window, and stare out at the empty street, searching for a calm I couldn't find inside the house. During the day, I looked for chores that kept me far from Edward. I volunteered to run errands for the store or help Mrs. Miller, our neighbor, weed her garden. I told her I liked being among flowers, but really I just liked being far from home. She once asked why I dressed so warmly in the heat, and I told her it kept me from getting sunburned. Edward seemed to enjoy finding cracks in my defenses. If he saw me heading out, he'd offer to walk with me for safety. If I was in the kitchen, he'd appear behind me to reach something from a shelf. He never did anything in front of others that would raise suspicion. His skill was in trapping me where no one else could see. I began building small refuges inside the house. The attic, with its dust-covered boxes, became a place to breathe. The chicken coop, with its sharp smell and constant clucking, offered a strange sort of protection. I'd linger there, hands busy scattering feed, knowing it was one of the few places he rarely visited. My body began showing signs of the constant tension. Dark circles under my eyes, headaches almost daily. Dad would say I was just growing too fast, that I looked different because of it. I nodded, preferring he believe that rather than look too closely and see what I was hiding. At school, my grades slipped. Mrs. Thompson asked if I was sick. I told her I wasn't sleeping well, and she'd pat my hair gently, but didn't press. I think she suspected something, but she didn't dare give it a name. Her eyes lingered on me a second longer when I left each day, as if making sure I wouldn't break on the walk home. Time became strange. Days felt endless, but weeks passed without anything changing. Every small victory, like managing a whole afternoon without crossing paths with him, felt monumental, but they were always short-lived. The next day, it all started again. Sometimes I thought about telling Grandma. She had a firm voice and a sharp gaze, but Edward was careful around her, always attentive and helpful. He chopped wood, hung laundry, and she saw him as a blessing to the family. How could I tear down that image without being called a liar? I started measuring every word, every move. If I spoke too much, I feared saying something that would anger him. If I stayed too quiet, I feared he'd think I was trying to outsmart him. Life became like a chessboard, with me making cautious moves while he was always 3 ahead. Sundays were my reprieve. At church, among whispered prayers and the smell of incense, I felt invisible to him. I sat next to Annie and squeezed her hand tight, imagining that touch as a shield against everything bad. Faith didn't give me answers, but it gave me a place where the fear couldn't get so close. Over time, my greatest fear stopped being Edward himself. It became the thought that no one would believe me. That fear kept me silent, locked in a role I'd never chosen. Silence protected me, but it also slowly consumed me, like a candle burning away unseen. The first spark of resistance came without me planning it. One afternoon, Edward asked me to help move boxes in the shed. My instincts told me to refuse, but instead of saying no outright, I told him I had to finish an errand for Mrs. Miller. I didn't wait for his answer. I grabbed the basket and walked out. My heart pounded like a drum, but that tiny victory, choosing not to stay, gave me a feeling I hadn't had in a long time: control. I began studying his routines closely. I knew exactly when he stepped outside to smoke behind the barn, how long his trips to the store took, and his favorite excuses for being alone with me. I learned to move through the house like a shadow, planning my paths to avoid him. I couldn't confront him directly, but I could make his game harder to play. It was around. Then that Mrs. Miller started looking at me differently, with a mix of kindness and concern. One day as we picked tomatoes in her garden, she asked if everything was all right at home. Her voice was gentle, but her eyes were searching for something in my answer. I didn't know what to say, so I shifted the conversation to the harvest. Still, I noticed that from that day on, she always found a reason to have me come by at least once a day. Mrs. Thompson, my teacher, also began giving me extras. Tasks after school, sorting books, cleaning the chalkboard, anything to keep me a little longer. She never asked me outright what was wrong, but her quietness felt like a form of understanding, as if she knew she was giving me minutes of safety. At home, I started making sure I always sat next to James at the table. If I had to walk down a hallway and saw Edward approaching, I'd call Annie to come with me. I clung to their presence like a lifeline, even though they didn't understand why. Some nights, when everyone was asleep, I'd take out an old notebook that had belonged to Mom from the attic. In it, I began writing how I felt, not naming names or giving clear details, but enough to remember. It was like letting poison out, even if the words were clumsy and cramped. I promised myself that if I ever had to tell the truth, those pages would be my witness. I discovered that Edward grew more unsettled when I didn't react to his insinuations. If he touched my shoulder or spoke to me in a low voice, I kept my eyes elsewhere and said nothing. My indifference seemed to frustrate him, and while that carried its own risks, it gave me a small sense of victory. One day, without meaning to, I made him slip up in front of James. We were in the yard when Edward made a strange remark about how I walked. James shot him a sharp look, one I'd never seen on his face before. He didn't say anything then, but after that, he was more present whenever I was nearby. It felt like having a silent ally, though neither of us admitted it. Each small act of resistance reminded me that I wasn't only a passive victim. Even if I couldn't get him out of the house, I could still carve cracks into his control. And those cracks, however small, were my way of telling myself there was still a way out, even if I couldn't see it yet. The breaking point came on a gray autumn afternoon, the clouds hanging so low, it felt like you could touch them. Edward came back from the store earlier than usual, and I was alone in the kitchen peeling potatoes for dinner. I heard his footsteps in the hallway, and that familiar weight settled in my stomach. Before I could move, he was beside me, closing the door with a click that sounded louder than thunder. He spoke in that slow voice he used when he wanted to intimidate. He said my siblings didn't need me as much anymore, that it was time I learned new things. His hand moved toward my arm, and something inside me snapped. I don't know where the strength came from, but I shoved him hard. The chair behind him tipped over and crashed to the floor, the sound sharp enough to bring James running. Edward, quick as a snake, made up an excuse that I'd tripped and he was trying to help me. James looked straight into my eyes, searching for something that would confirm or deny the lie. I said nothing, but my silence wasn't the same anymore. It had an edge. James didn't argue, but he stayed in the kitchen until I was done. That night, when everyone was asleep, I heard James stir. He walked to my bedroom door, didn't open it, and whispered, "You're not alone." Just a whisper, but enough to loosen the knot in my throat. For the first time in years, I felt that someone believed me. If this moment touched you, please like this video so that more people can find courage through this story. The next day, I made a decision. I couldn't wait for fear to fade. I had to move before he did. I started planning, find a moment when Edward was distracted, leave the house, go to Mrs. Miller's, or even the school. I knew if I crossed Main Street and reached a place full of people, he wouldn't follow. That moment came sooner than I expected. Edward and Dad left early to fix a fence out on the property. Annie was at a friend's, and James had gone to the mill. I was alone, with a silence that for once didn't scare me, but felt like an opening. I grabbed Mom's notebook from the attic, tucked it under my blouse, and slipped out the back door. Walking quickly, Down the streets of town, every step felt like a small victory. The cold air stung my cheeks, but it also burned away some of the fear. I didn't know if this would be the day everything changed, but I knew I could no longer play the role he'd forced on me. I reached Mrs. Miller's house without looking back. I knocked hard, and when she opened the door, I didn't have to say much. Her eyes went from my face to my shaking hands, and she knew something wasn't right. She brought me in, closed the door, and sat me at the kitchen table. The smell of fresh cornbread wrapped around me, but this time it wasn't a memory of my mother. It was an anchor, a sign I was somewhere safe. She didn't wait long before calling Mrs. Thompson. Between the two of them, they built a wall of calm around me, asking gentle questions without pushing too hard. I didn't give every detail, just enough for them to know I wasn't going back home while Edward was there. Mrs. Thompson promised she'd speak with Grandma and Dad. Her voice, steady, firm, was the closest thing I'd felt to safety in years. That night I didn't sleep in my bed, but in Mrs. Miller's small guest room wrapped in a thick quilt with the window shut tight. Outside, the wind howled as always, but it no longer sounded like an enemy. For the first time in a long time, I fell asleep without fearing a door might open in the dark. A few days later, Edward was gone. I don't know if it was Dad's decision, Grandma's insistence, or Mrs. Thompson's intervention. No one explained, and I didn't ask. All that mattered was that his shadow was no longer in my path. The air in the house became breathable again, and though healing didn't come overnight, I began to feel like I could grow without his weight pressing down on me. Now at 74, I know that little girl didn't walk away unscarred, but she did walk away free. I learned that truth, no matter how painful, is always lighter than silence. If this story spoke to you, please like, subscribe, and share. It gives me strength to keep going. And tell me in the comments, what did you feel while hearing this story?